Hospitals are meant to heal, but sometimes they become the setting for our worst nightmares. They're places of life and death, where the veil between worlds can feel paper-thin. The sterile hallways, the constant beeping of machines, the hushed conversations in the middle of the night, it all creates an atmosphere ripe for the strange, dark, and mysterious. The stories you're about to hear aren't fiction. They are real-life accounts from doctors, nurses, and patients who experienced something truly terrifying within the walls of these institutions. These aren't your typical ghost stories told around a campfire. These are bone-chilling events that happen to real people in real places, all across the United States. From the bustling emergency rooms of major cities to the quiet, isolated wards of rural towns, the one thing these places have in common is the lingering sense that something is not quite right. These medical professionals and patients went in expecting routine shifts and recoveries, but what they found instead was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, something that defies logical explanation. So, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the places we trust to keep us safe. Because tonight we're checking into 6 different hospitals, each with its own dark secret. And like the people in these stories, once you're in, there might not be a way out. Before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, so please hit that like button, it really helps the channel get noticed. Our first story takes us to a mid-sized community hospital in Ohio, a place that during the day is a bustling hub of activity. But at night, especially on the 3rd floor, which housed the long-term care wing, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The hallways grew long and dim, the silence broken only by the hum of a floor polisher, or the distant, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. A young nurse named Sarah was just a few months into her job, often pulling the dreaded night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. She was diligent and compassionate, but even she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that crept in after midnight. It started subtly. At first it was just the call light for room 313. The room was empty, had been for weeks, pending a deep clean and sanitization after its last occupant passed away. But every night, around 3:15 a.m., the light above the door would flash, and the soft chime would echo down the hall. The first few times Sarah would walk down, check the panel, and reset it, blaming it on a simple electrical fault. Her senior colleague, a veteran nurse named Brenda, would just shake her head and mutter, "It's just the building settling, kid. You get used to it." But it wasn't just the call light. Sarah started noticing other things. The automatic doors to the ward, the heavy ones that required a key card, would sometimes be propped open with a small rubber wedge, when she knew for a fact she had been the last one to close them. Then she started hearing things. A soft shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet in paper slippers, coming from the far end of the hallway, always stopping just before it came into the light of the nurse's station. She'd get up to investigate, her heart pounding in her chest, but she would never find anyone. One night, Brenda was out sick, and Sarah was alone on the floor with only a nursing assistant who was busy on the opposite side of the wing. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She tried to distract herself with paperwork, but her eyes kept darting towards the security monitor that showed a live feed of the main hallway. The camera was grainy, but it did its job. As she stared, she saw a flicker of movement near room 313. It was a shadow, tall and thin, that seemed to detach itself from the other shadows cast by the dim lighting. Sarah froze, her pen hovering over the chart. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath fogging the glass. The figure was motionless for a long moment, a dark silhouette against the pale wall. Then slowly, it began to move down the hall, directly towards the nurse's station. It didn't walk like a person. It glided, a fluid, unnatural movement that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She couldn't make out any features, just a humanoid shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. Panicked, Sarah fumbled for the phone to call security, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely dial the extension. As she was about to press the call button, she looked back at the monitor. The figure was gone. The hallway was empty. But then she heard it. A soft, raspy whisper that seemed to come from right behind her chair. It was a single word. Her name. Sarah! She whipped around, knocking her chair over with a loud clatter, but there was nothing there. The air was cold, and the only sound was the frantic thumping of her own heart. She didn't wait for security. She grabbed her purse and ran, not stopping until she was in the brightly lit main lobby. She told her supervisor what happened, expecting to be dismissed or laughed at. But the older woman just looked at her with a grave expression. She explained that years ago, a patient in room 313, a deeply troubled man, had become obsessed with a young nurse. He would follow her on her rounds, watch her from his doorway, and whisper her name when she passed. He died in that room, but it seemed he never truly left. The supervisor told Sarah that several other young nurses had reported similar experiences: the call light, the open doors, the shuffling sounds, and the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence. They had tried to keep it quiet to avoid causing a panic. The hospital had even had the room blessed, but the activity never completely stopped. It was as if the man's obsession had tethered him to that floor, forever stalking the night shift. Sarah requested an immediate transfer to the day shift in the pediatric wing, as far away from the third floor as she could get. She never worked another night shift in that hospital again. But sometimes, late at night, even in the safety of her own home, she'll hear a faint shuffling sound from down the hall, and in those moments she can't shake the terrifying feeling that she's still being watched. Our next story takes place in a large, sprawling hospital in rural Pennsylvania, a facility that has stood for over a century. The story revolves around a patient named Harold, an elderly man in his late 80s who was admitted for observation after a bad fall. Harold was frail, suffered from severe dementia, and was a significant fall risk, meaning he required constant monitoring. He was placed in a room at the very end of a long corridor on the 4th floor, a room that had a direct line of sight from the nurses' station. 2 nurses, David and Maria, were on duty that evening. Harold was a quiet patient. Due to his dementia, he rarely spoke and spent most of his time sleeping. Around 10 p.m., David did his final rounds for the hour. He checked on Harold, adjusted his pillows, made sure his bed alarm was activated, a pressure-sensitive pad that would sound a loud alarm if he tried to get out of bed, and noted in the chart that the patient was resting comfortably. The room had only one door, and the window was sealed shut and locked, a standard safety measure on the upper floors. An hour later, at 11 p.m., it was Maria's turn to do the rounds. She walked the length of the quiet hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. When she reached Harold's room, she pushed the door open and peeked inside. The bed was empty. The sheets were thrown back as if someone had just gotten up, but Harold was nowhere to be seen. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She quickly stepped inside, checking the small attached bathroom. It was empty. The closet was empty. Harold was gone. A cold sense of dread washed over Maria. The first, most terrifying thought was that he had fallen somewhere and was lying injured and helpless. She immediately called out for David, her voice tight with panic. David rushed down the hall. Together they searched the room again, looking under the bed, behind the curtains, every conceivable hiding place. Nothing. The most perplexing part was that the bed alarm had never gone off. They tested it. It was working perfectly. There was no way Harold could have gotten out of bed without setting it off. They immediately initiated a code yellow, the hospital's code for a missing patient. Security was alerted and a floor-by-floor search began. Every nurse, doctor, and staff member on duty was mobilized. They checked every room, every supply closet, every stairwell, and every public area. The hospital went into lockdown. No one was allowed to enter or leave the building. The security team reviewed the camera footage from the hallway. The camera, positioned right outside Harold's room, showed David entering at 10 p.m. and leaving a few minutes later. It then showed Maria entering at 11 p.m. In the entire hour between their checks, no one, absolutely no one, had entered or exited Harold's room. The search grew more frantic as the hours ticked by. Harold's family was called, and they arrived distraught and terrified. How could a frail, elderly man simply vanish from a locked room, from a bed with an alarm, without anyone seeing a thing? The police were brought in, and they conducted their own, more thorough search of the hospital and the surrounding grounds. They found no signs of forced entry into the room and no indication that Harold had ever left the building. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. Days turned into a week. The official investigation stalled, leaving everyone with a deep sense of unease. The hospital staff whispered theories in hushed tones. Some thought another patient might have wandered in and somehow led Harold out through a blind spot, but the camera footage debunked that. Others whispered about the history of the hospital, which had been built on the grounds of an old asylum. They spoke of rooms where patients had died under mysterious circumstances, especially the room at the end of the hall, Harold's room. Harold was never found. No trace of him, his hospital gown, or his slippers ever turned up inside or outside the hospital. His disappearance remains an official unsolved missing person case. The hospital quietly closed that room at the end of the hall, claiming it was for renovations, but the staff knew the real reason. It was a place tainted by an impossible event. For David and Maria, the memory of that night never faded. They would forever be haunted by the image of that empty bed and the chilling, unanswerable question, where did Harold go? In a renowned surgical center in Chicago, Operating Room 4 was known for two things: its state-of-the-art equipment and its unsettling reputation. Surgeons, anesthesiologists, and nurses, highly rational, scientifically minded professionals, would share stories in the break room about OR4, but only when they were sure no one from administration was listening. They spoke of a persistent, inexplicable chill in the room, even when the thermostat was set to a normal temperature, and a strange, heavy feeling in the air, like the pressure before a storm. Dr. Alastair Finch, a veteran cardiac surgeon with hands as steady as a rock, was a man of logic and reason. He scoffed at the stories, attributing them to the high-stress environment and overactive imaginations. That was until a Tuesday afternoon during a routine triple bypass surgery. The procedure was going smoothly. Dr. Finch was focused, his team working around him like a well-oiled machine. The only sounds in the room were the rhythmic beep of the heart-lung machine, the quiet suction, and Dr. Finch's calm, steady commands. Suddenly, a surgical tray of instruments on the far side of the room, untouched by anyone, rattled violently for a few seconds and then fell to the floor with a deafening crash. Every single person in the room froze. The scrub nurse, a young woman named Chloe, let out a small gasp. Dr. Finch, without looking up from the patient's open chest, snapped, "Someone get that cleaned up! Let's maintain sterility and focus." He assumed someone had bumped it, a clumsy but explainable mistake. But as the surgery continued, other things began to happen. A cabinet door, one that was always kept latched, swung open on its own. The digital clock on the wall flickered, its numbers scrambling into gibberish before resetting to the correct time. The room grew noticeably colder, so much so that the anesthesiologist commented on it, checking the room's environmental controls, which showed everything was normal. A feeling of dread began to permeate the sterile environment, a feeling that they were not alone. The most terrifying moment came when Dr. Finch was meticulously suturing a graft. He felt a distinct icy cold touch on the back of his neck, like a single frozen finger tracing a line down his spine. The sensation was so real, so unexpected that his steady hands faltered for a split second. He flinched, instinctively turning his head slightly. "Who just touched me?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The nurses and assistants around him looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. No one was behind him. No one was even close enough to have touched him. Chloe, the scrub nurse, whispered, "Doctor, it's the boy." Dr. Finch shot her a look that could curdle milk. This was not the time for ghost stories. But, after the surgery was successfully completed and the patient was safely in recovery, he pulled Chloe aside and demanded an explanation. Her face was pale as she recounted the unofficial history of OR4. Years ago, a 9-year-old boy had died on that very operating table during what should have been a simple appendectomy. It was a tragic, 1 in a million allergic reaction to the anesthesia. According to the stories passed down through the staff, the boy's spirit never left. He was known to be a mischievous but harmless presence. He would play with the equipment, open cabinets, and occasionally he would reach out and touch someone. They said he was drawn to the surgeons, perhaps fascinated by the very thing that had failed to save him. He was especially active during long, complicated procedures, almost as if he were trying to watch over their shoulders. Dr. Finch, the staunch skeptic, was shaken to his core. He couldn't deny what he had felt. It wasn't a draft or a muscle twitch, it was a deliberate cold touch. He tried to rationalize it, to find any logical explanation, but he couldn't. The combination of the falling tray, the flickering clock, the cold spot, and the phantom touch was too much to be a coincidence. From that day on, Dr. Finch never scoffed at the stories about OR4 again. While he would still perform surgeries in that room if he had to, he always did so with a newfound uneasy respect for its unseen occupant. And before every single procedure in that room, he would whisper under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear, "Okay, kid, let's do this together. Just please, don't touch the instruments." Deep in the basement of an old Gothic-style hospital in Boston lies the morgue. It's a place most hospital employees avoid, a cold, sterile, and silent world of stainless steel and hushed reverence. The only people who willingly venture down there are the medical examiners and the morgue attendants. One of these attendants was a man named Arthur, a stoic individual in his late 50s who had worked the night shift in the morgue for over 20 years. He thought he had seen and heard everything. He was wrong. The events began on a particularly cold winter night. Arthur was alone, as he usually was, catching up on paperwork under the harsh fluorescent lights of his small office. The only other occupant of the morgue that night was a single body, an elderly woman who had passed away peacefully on the 7th floor earlier that day. She was resting in one of the refrigerated units awaiting collection by the funeral home in the morning. The silence in the morgue was absolute, a heavy, pressing quiet that Arthur had long since grown accustomed to. Around 2 in the morning, Arthur was startled by a sound. It was faint at first, so faint he thought he might have imagined it or that it was just the old building's pipes groaning. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. It was the sound of a woman crying, not loud, hysterical sobbing, but a soft, mournful weeping that seemed to echo from the main storage room where the refrigerated units were located. Arthur put down his pen, his brow furrowed. He was the only living soul in the basement. He got up from his desk and walked cautiously toward the main room. The heavy door swung open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The weeping sound was more distinct in here, seeming to emanate from the far wall of steel doors. A chill, entirely different from the morgue's usual cold, ran down Arthur's spine. He stood frozen in the doorway, listening. The crying was heartbreaking, filled with a profound sense of loss and sorrow. It sounded so real, so human. His rational mind kicked in, searching for an explanation. Could it be a sound traveling through the ventilation system from another part of the hospital? He had worked here for 2 decades, and had never heard anything like it. Could it be a prank by one of the younger orderlies? Unlikely. No one came down to the morgue for fun, especially not at this hour. He walked slowly towards the wall of units, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The weeping seemed to be coming from directly behind the door of Unit 6, the one holding the body of the elderly woman. Arthur's hand trembled slightly as he reached out and placed his palm against the cold steel. The sound was clearer now, muffled but unmistakable. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, right on the other side of the door. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to lock the door and not look back until the sun came up. But his professionalism, his sense of duty, warred with his fear. He took a deep breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to be sure. He had to know what was happening. With a surge of adrenaline, he unlatched the heavy lock on Unit 6 and pulled the handle. The tray slid out with a smooth, metallic rumble. On the tray lay the elderly woman, exactly as he had left her, shrouded and still. And in that exact moment, the crying stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow more terrifying than the sound it replaced. Arthur stood there for a full minute, staring at the peaceful, deceased woman. There was no one else in the unit. There was no hidden speaker. There was no logical reason for what he had just heard. He slowly pushed the tray back in, latched the door, and backed out of the room, his eyes never leaving Unit 6. He didn't return to his paperwork. He sat in his office, staring at the wall, until his shift ended at dawn. He never told anyone what happened. Who would believe him? They would think the years of solitude and grim work had finally gotten to him. But the experience changed him. He never felt truly alone in the morgue again. On several subsequent nights he would hear the faint, sorrowful weeping, always seeming to come from a newly occupied unit. He never opened another one. He would simply stop what he was doing, listen for a moment, and whisper a quiet, "I'm sorry for your loss," into the cold, silent air. In a modern high-tech hospital in Seattle, there was one piece of equipment that seemed to defy all logic and technology: Elevator C. It was one of 4 main elevators in the central bank, used by staff, patients, and visitors alike. But Elevator C had a mind of its own. Staff members would often joke about it, calling it the scenic route because it had a tendency to take passengers to floors they hadn't selected, or sometimes to floors that didn't seem to exist. Maintenance had been called dozens of times, but they could never find a single thing wrong with its wiring or programming. A young resident, Dr. Ben Carter, learned about Elevator C's peculiarities the hard way. It was late, near the end of a grueling 36-hour shift, and he was completely exhausted. He needed to get from the 8th floor, the surgical ward, down to the 1st floor lobby to grab a coffee before his final rounds. He pressed the down button and the doors to Elevator C slid open. He stepped inside, pressed the button for one, and leaned against the back wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The elevator began to descend, but after passing the 7th floor, it didn't slow down. It passed 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 without stopping. Ben's eyes snapped open. He watched the floor indicator continue to descend, past the lobby. G for ground floor went by, then B1 for the first basement level, which housed the labs, then B2, the maintenance and laundry level. The elevator was still going down. Ben frantically started pushing the door open button and the button for the lobby, but nothing happened. The elevator was completely unresponsive. Then, the indicator light for B3 lit up. This was strange. Ben had been working at the hospital for 6 months, and he had never heard of a third basement level. It wasn't on any of the hospital directories or fire escape plans he had ever seen. The elevator finally slowed and came to a smooth stop. The bell chimed softly, and the doors slid open. Ben stared out into a place that he didn't recognize, a place that felt instantly wrong. It wasn't a modern hospital basement. It looked like a relic from a bygone era. The hallway was narrow, with peeling paint on the walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else. Something antiseptic and cloying like old-fashioned carbolic acid. Along the walls were old rusted gurneys and what looked like antique medical equipment covered in white sheets. There was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to suck the air out of the elevator. Ben stood frozen, half in and half out of the elevator, a cold fear gripping him. He had no idea where he was. This place wasn't part of the hospital he knew. It felt like he had stepped back in time. He saw a doorway at the end of the hall, and for a terrifying second, he thought he saw a figure in a long white coat standing there just watching him before it retreated back into the darkness. That was enough for him. He slammed his hand on the door close button, praying it would work. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. He jabbed it again and again, his panic rising. Finally the doors slowly slid shut, closing out the view of the forgotten hallway. Ben mashed the one button repeatedly. The elevator shuddered once, then began to ascend. It didn't stop until it reached the lobby. When the doors opened to the familiar brightly lit space, Ben practically fell out, gasping for breath. He stumbled over to the security desk, his face ashen. He asked the veteran guard, a man named George, about the third basement. George looked at him, his expression unreadable, and then shook his head. "Son, there is no B3. The hospital's foundations only go down to B2, Ben insisted, describing what he saw. George's expression softened into one of weary understanding. He leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first one to take a ride in Elevator C," he said. "That elevator sometimes, it goes to a place that used to be here. The original hospital from the early 1900s had a sub-basement. It's where they kept the difficult patients, the ones they couldn't help. It was sealed off and buried when they built this new building on top of it. But sometimes, Elevator C remembers the way down." Ben never took Elevator C again, and on the rare occasions he had to go to the basement, he always took the stairs. Our final story comes from a pediatric oncology ward in a hospital in North Carolina. This ward, by its very nature, was a place of immense emotional highs and lows. It was a place where brave children fought incredible battles, supported by dedicated nurses and hopeful families. But for several months, it was also a place visited by something else, something that couldn't be seen, but was most definitely felt. Staff and parents started referring to it as the visitor. It began with the children. A little girl named Lily, who was recovering from a round of chemotherapy, told her mother that a shadow man had come into her room the night before. She said he was very tall and thin and didn't have a face, but that he just stood in the corner of her room and watched her. She wasn't scared of him, she said, just curious. Her mother dismissed it as a dream or a side effect of her medication, but then other children started talking about the same figure. A young boy in the next room described a tall shadow that would walk up and down the hallway at night, peeking into the rooms. Like Lily, he didn't seem frightened by it, more intrigued. The nurses began to notice a pattern. The children who reported seeing the shadow man were always the ones who were most ill, the ones closest to the brink. The staff started experiencing things too. Nurses working the night shift would feel sudden, inexplicable cold spots as they walked the halls. They would hear the soft whisper of a footstep behind them, but when they turned around, no one would be there. Doors to empty rooms would be found ajar, and toys in the playroom would be rearranged overnight, set up as if someone had been playing with them. One nurse, named Clara, had the most direct encounter. She was at the central nursing station late one night, updating patient charts. The ward was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the machines. Out of the corner of her eye she saw movement at the far end of the hall. She looked up and saw it, a tall, impossibly thin shadow detaching itself from the wall. It had a vaguely human shape but no discernible features. It was a void, a patch of darkness more profound than the surrounding dimness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the stories from the kids and her colleagues but had never believed them. Now she was seeing it for herself. The shadow figure stood motionless for a moment as if observing her. Then, it began to glide down the hallway, not towards her, but towards the room of a very sick little boy named Sam, whose condition had taken a turn for the worse that evening. The figure reached Sam's door and, instead of opening it, it seemed to just pass through the solid wood, melting into it and disappearing inside. Clara was paralyzed with a mixture of fear and a strange sense of awe. She didn't know what to do. A few minutes later, the heart monitor connected to the central station for Sam's room began to sound an alarm. His heart had stopped. Clara and the other on-call staff rushed into the room, but it was too late. They couldn't revive him. Little Sam had passed away peacefully in his sleep. As the team worked, Clara couldn't help but glance around the room, into the corners, searching for the shadow she had seen enter. But it was gone. The sightings of the Shadow Man continued on the ward. The staff eventually came to a quiet, unspoken understanding of who or what he was. They didn't see him as a malevolent entity. Instead, they began to see him as a psychopomp, a guide. He was the unseen visitor who came for the children when it was their time to leave, a silent, dark escort to whatever lay beyond. It was a terrifying thought, but in a strange way it also brought a small measure of comfort. The idea that these children were not alone in their final moments. The sterile white walls of a hospital are designed to be clean, orderly, and reassuring, but as we've heard tonight, sometimes they bear witness to events that are anything but. From a spectral stalker on the night shift to an elevator with a destination in the past, these institutions of healing can harbor deep, unsettling mysteries. The line between life and death is walked every day in these hallways, and it seems that sometimes something crosses that line and decides to stay behind, becoming a permanent resident. These accounts from doctors, nurses, and patients serve as a chilling reminder that there are some things that science and medicine cannot explain. These are rational people, dedicated to logic and evidence, who were confronted with the impossible. Their experiences linger long after the physical scars have healed, leaving behind a haunting question about the nature of the places we trust with our very lives. The next time you find yourself walking down a quiet hospital corridor at night, you might find yourself listening a little more closely to the silence. The stories we've shared are just a handful of the countless strange and terrifying tales that echo through hospitals across the country. Every ward, every operating room, every morgue has its own stories, its own secrets buried under layers of linoleum and fluorescent light. It makes you wonder what really happens after the visitors leave and the lights are dimmed. Would you dare spend a night in one of these hospitals?